Ibrahim Traoré did not declare war. He did something more terrifying to those in power. He declared independence of thought, of destiny, of Africa itself. In early 2024, three countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso upped the old rules. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, the Sahel Alliance was born, not as an act of rebellion, but of rebirth. Africa News called it the most daring challenge to post-colonial order in decades. Yet the streets of Ouagadougou were quiet, not with fear, but with a strange, radiant pride. Burkina Faso, once dismissed by international pundits, had become the epicenter of an awakening. Let the world hear your voices, spread this message. In early 2024, three countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, upped the old rules. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, the Sahel Alliance was born, not as an act of rebellion, but of rebirth. Africa News called it the most daring challenge to post-colonial order in decades. Yet the streets of Ouagadougou were quiet, not with fear, but with a strange, radiant pride. Burkina Faso, once dismissed by international pundits, had become the epicenter of an awakening. This was no coup, it was a declaration that Africa would no longer ask for permission to breathe. In the halls of Western capitals, anxiety spread. France, whose military presence had long dotted the Sahel, found itself shut out. The European Union issued carefully worded concerns, but Ibrahim Traoré said nothing inflammatory. He did not rant or threaten. He simply acted, asserting that Burkina Faso and its neighbors had a right to chart their own course, without foreign supervision. If this story moves you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Education. 2. It was weaponized, but in the most noble way. In villages across Burkina Faso, radio stations ran civic programs about sovereignty and unity. Teachers told students about the power of self-determination. Families spoke of Traoré not as a soldier, but as a teacher of courage. In this struggle, books were as vital as battalions. Ibrahim Traoré's vision was not of conquest, but of consciousness. Africa News covered the developments, not with panic, but with a question. What if these nations are not breaking away from order, but building a new one? Across the Sahel, flags changed, contracts ended, old agreements with France were torn apart. And still, there were no riots, only order, dignity, and the quiet hum of construction. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe sovereignty still matters. Some said the silence was misleading, that the calm in Burkina Faso was the calm before collapse, but they were wrong. The silence was discipline. The silence was preparation. And when the first joint training exercise of the AES was announced, codename Sahel Shielded, sent a clear message. This was not chaos. This was control. Let the world hear your voices, spread this message. In local newspapers in Burkina Faso, editorials did not celebrate war. They discussed agriculture, education, electricity. What mattered most was not revenge but results. If sovereignty meant nothing changes for the poor, then what was the point? That was Ibrahim Traoré's litmus test. Not theory, reality. What makes a leader dangerous to foreign powers is not how loud he shouts, but how deeply his people listen. In that first week of AES formation, no one knew what would come next. But one thing was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer a follower. It had become a compass. They said it was about restoring order. But behind the closed doors of Abuja, a storm was brewing, not between nations, but within them. The economic community of West African states, ECOWAS, did not hesitate. Within weeks of the AES formation, they called for an emergency summit in Nigeria. The message was stern. The Sahel Alliance must dissolve, and the military governments of Ibrahim Traoré and his allies must return to the democratic path, supervised by international observers. But, as Africa News reported, the halls of Abuja were not unified. Nigeria feared a precedent that could inspire other coups. Burkina Faso, once silent, now stood at the center of defiance. If you believe sovereignty is worth defending, let your voice be heard. The economic community of West African states, ECOWAS, did not hesitate. Within weeks of the AES formation, they called for an emergency summit in Nigeria. The message was stern. The Sahel Alliance must dissolve, and the military governments of Ibrahim Traoré and his allies must return to the democratic path, supervised by international observers. But as Africa News reported, the halls of Abuja were not unified. Nigeria feared a precedent that could inspire other coups. Burkina Faso, once silent, now stood at the center of defiance. Ghana expressed doubts about the use of force. Senegal warned that an intervention might trigger a humanitarian crisis. Yet others, nudged by foreign whispers from Paris and Brussels, argued for swift and severe measures. We cannot allow this alliance to thrive. One diplomat was quoted in Africa News. It undermines everything we've built since the 1990s. Comment below if you think Africa deserves its own future, but what exactly was built since the 1990s? Dependency, repeated loans, electoral systems that existed more on paper than in practice, and soldiers who saluted two flags sewn of their nation, and one of foreign donors. Burkina Faso's move, with Ibrahim Traoré at the helm, shook the ground beneath these arrangements. The people, especially in rural regions, saw not rebellion but reclamation. They didn't ask to return to a failed version of democracy. They asked for something new. In Ouagadougou, one farmer said to a reporter, "If this is military rule, but my children are safe, I have food, and we build our own roads. Why is that worse than what we had before?" Subscribe for more stories that mainstream media won't tell you. Back in Abuja, the arguments grew tense. Western powers were watching closely. France, losing grip over its former colonies, began lobbying for economic sanctions, freezing of assets, suspension from regional trade platforms. The word intervention was whispered more often than spoken. Africa News ran an editorial, "Is it democracy we seek to protect to the illusion of control?" Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré issued no long statements. He ordered border coordination. He strengthened local radio stations. He told his cabinet, "We will not attack, but we will not retreat." Those words became a slogan across social media in Burkina Faso. Comment below if you think Africa deserves its own future. And in that digital silence, a different kind of leadership was forming. Not loud, not performative, but committed. Ibrahim Traoré knew that one mistake could give ECOWAS the excuse it needed. So he gave them nothing. While ECOWAS debated, AES organized, troops rotated quietly along the borders. Civil society groups ran educational campaigns about food security and national production. In the countryside, families planted more crops, not because of orders, but because hope had returned. If you believe sovereignty is worth defending, let your voice be heard. In the north of Burkina Faso, a teacher resumed classes after weeks of threats from insurgents. "We are no longer waiting for help to come," she said. "We are becoming our own help." That was the real threat to the old system. Not just military control, but psychological liberation. Africa News called it a shift in the African imagination, one where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré were not seen as exceptions, but examples. Comment below if you think Africa deserves its own future. No tanks crossed the border. No bombs fell from the sky. But by July 2024, a quieter war had begun, not one of bullets, but of hunger, fear, and isolation. Africa News reported how mothers in Bamako shared homemade antiseptics when medical shipments stopped. Rural engineers refurbished broken irrigation systems, refusing to let crops wither. One man said, "They block borders, but we never blocked our minds." Ibrahim Traoré did not lash out. He launched Security Self-Reliance Week, a grassroots campaign, encouraging each citizen to take one action for community resilience. From composting food to repairing roads, the people responded, not with slogans, but with sweat. ECOWAS, with tacit support from France and the EU, moved to strangle the Sahel Alliance economically. On the 2nd of July, regional banks were ordered to halt all transfers to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Agricultural shipments stalled, fuel depôts emptied. The people, not the politicians, bore the first wounds. But instead of rage, there was resolve. Africa News cited internal ECOWAS concerns. Have we pushed too far? Nigeria feared the blowback. Ghana questioned the morality. One anonymous diplomat said, "They may be military rulers, but they're building trust in ways our democracies forgot." International observers noted a paradox. The more AES was squeezed, the more coherent its internal strength became. Community radio surged. Literacy drives expanded. Even some moderate opposition groups refused to support sanctions, citing their inhumanity. Burkina Faso streets did not erupt with riots. Instead, they blossomed with painted murals, depictions of unity, resilience, and memory. Children raised 3 fingers, one each, for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, not to fight, but to remember. What the international community viewed as sanctions, the locals called siege. Still, no protests turned violent, no government building was burned. Instead, neighborhood gatherings became platforms of education on sovereignty, on history, on survival. In Kaya, one schoolteacher stayed behind, while others fled. On the radio, she said, "We may be hungry, but we are not hollow. The future of our children is worth more than the comfort of fear." In the heart of Burkina Faso, communities turned inward. Villagers in Kaya developed new salt extraction methods. In Niger, teachers began hosting night classes powered by handmade solar batteries. The people adapted not out of luxury, but necessity. Ibrahim Traoré called this the first test of national soul. They thought they could suffocate a revolution with hunger, but when embargoes failed, a more insidious weapon was deployed: division from within. When economic sanctions did not bring the Sahel Alliance AES to its knees, ECOWAS and its allies changed strategy. Media outlets across the region began publishing anonymous reports hinting at internal fractures. Stories claimed that Mali was uncomfortable with Ibrahim Traoré's dominance, or that Niger was being excluded from key decision-making. While no official evidence supported these claims, the repetition planted doubt both at home and abroad. Africa News documented these efforts in a report titled "The War Without Guns." It revealed a sharp uptick in articles with phrases like AES faltering or Burkina Faso isolated. Some of these outlets had previously received funding from NGOs closely linked to European governments. The aim was not to inform, it was to fracture, not to confront, but to corrode. In response, the AES leadership acted swiftly. Burkina Faso's financial oversight bodies initiated audits of NGO funding. Mali imposed temporary controls on foreign media broadcasts. Niger invited international observers to attend transparency forums held in their capitals, where ministers answered unfiltered public questions for hours. One official said, "We don't fear criticism, we fear manipulation." The strategy did not stop at media. Underground opposition groups, Onze Dormants, began resurfacing. In Ouagadougou and Niamey, small protests emerged, calling for a return to civilian rule. Though numbers were low, international headlines declared, "Democracy awakens in AES." To locals, it felt scripted. "It's not democracy when it's funded by foreign embassies," said a student in Kaya. Ibrahim Traoré refused to be drawn into inflammatory statements. Instead, he launched a series of public forums titled "Nation in Conversation." Citizens, teachers, nurses, students were invited to speak. Their concerns were aired live, unedited. One farmer said, "We don't reject democracy, we reject hypocrisy." Meanwhile, France and the EU pushed multilateral institutions to freeze development aid. The IMF and World Bank halted water, electricity, and education projects, citing instability. But people on the ground saw the pattern. "They're using poverty as leverage," said a school principal in Mali. Still, community-run clinics and schools persisted, powered by solar panels and volunteer teachers. In a symbolic act, AES governments declared the 20th of July as Sovereignty Day. Across Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, villages held flag-raising ceremonies. No military parades, no chants of hate, just music, poetry, and silence. A sign not of defiance but of endurance. Africa News broadcast a segment showing children in Burkina Faso drawing maps of Africa with bright red hearts over the Sahel region. In classrooms once abandoned, teachers had returned. In fields once burned, new seeds were sown. "We're not just resisting," said one teacher, "we're rebuilding." This phase of the conflict was no longer about political structurate, was about moral legitimacy. AES wasn't just defending its borders, it was defending the right to exist differently. And the people, though pressured by scarcity and propaganda, it began to ask hard questions. Why must our democracy look like yours? As the media war raged, one phrase began trending across West African social media: "We stand still." It wasn't a call to arms, it was a declaration. We are not moving backward. We are not breaking apart. We are not alone. Subscribe to follow stories that challenge the old world order. What would you do if your voice was drowned out by propaganda? Leave your thoughts below. Share this if you believe dignity cannot be embargoed. When the world turned its back, the Sahel did not collapse, it adapted. And what came next defied every rule written by old empires. The harder ECOWAS and its backers pressed, the more resilient the Sahel Alliance AES became. Economic embargoes could cripple trade, but not spirit. What began as a military coalition transformed into a self-reliant civic movement. Local councils in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger coordinated food exchanges across village networks. Farmers in the north sent millet south. Artisans in the south crafted tools for harvest. This was not aided, was autonomy. Africa News featured weekly stories of village ingenuity. A broken water pump in Niamey was fixed with bicycle parts. In Bamako, a school reopened in a repurposed church basement, run entirely by volunteers. Ibrahim Traoré himself toured rural province, not in convoys but on foot, stopping to speak directly with market vendors, nurses, and students. He asked not for applause, but for patience. His message was clear: if we walk alone today, it's so our children can run tomorrow. International analysts watched with confusion. Burkina Faso and its neighbors were supposed to fall apart. Instead, satellite images showed the opposite: new roads being built, deforested areas replanted, and small factories reopening. One UN observer admitted off-record, "We underestimated them. They're building something none of us fully understand." Ibrahim Traoré's weekly address aired not from a marble palace, but from a public square. He quoted African philosophers instead of political theory. One night, in front of a crowd in Ouagadougou, he said, "Freedom isn't given, it's rebuilt. One nail, one stone, one truth at a time." The crowd answered, "A luta continua." The struggle continues, but not all was smooth. Inflation remained a threat, with regional trade disrupted. Prices for essentials like fuel and medicine surged. The AES governments launched what they called the Equity Economy Planner temporary rationing system, where wealthier citizens voluntarily limited purchases to ensure access for the poorest. Though controversial, it was embraced by many. A merchant in Gao said, "This is not sacrifice, it's solidarity. To bolster food security." AES announced the launch of the Sahel Agro-Vanguardian initiative to train young farmers in sustainable techniques. Dozens of mobile agriculture schools roamed the countryside. In Burkina Faso, a 17-year-old named Kaudbi shared his experience with Africa News. "We're not waiting for help. We're becoming the help." Ibrahim Traoré remained central to this transformation. Despite pressure, he did not tighten control over the press. Opposition journalists continued to publish, and government officials regularly appeared on live forums to answer tough questions. The tactic wasn't censorship, it was transparency. The tool wasn't fear, it was faith. CTA soft. If you believe leadership means listening more than shouting, like and comment below. What does true sovereignty mean to you? Meanwhile, Africa News broadcast a rare interview with a retired ECOWAS diplomat who said, off record, "The problem is not that AES defied us, it's that they might succeed without us." That fear was real. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could thrive without dependency, what message would that send to the rest of Africa? It was not tanks that came next, nor foreign soldiers on desert roads. What came was quieter and far more insidious. In early July, as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were stabilizing under the AES alliance, something began to shift from within, not in the streets, not in the skies, but in whispers, screens, and currency trails. Suddenly, international media began broadcasting anonymous reports. Mali unhappy with Traoré's dominance. Niger sidelined in AES decision-making. French-language papers circulated rumors of a fracture in leadership with Ibrahim Traoré, portrayed as overreaching, even authoritarian. None of the reports were verified. All were quickly denied. But the seed of doubt had been sown. Africa News identified over 60 such reports across regional outlets in just 1 week, many published from press rooms in Lagos, Paris, and Brussels. While official sources denied involvement, internal leaks suggested coordinated efforts to destabilize AES from the inside. And it did not stop at media. Unregistered funds began flowing into AES territories from anonymous donors to pro-democracy organizations and defunct political parties. Former ministers who had disappeared since the coups re-emerged, holding quiet rallies in Ouagadougou and Niamey. They spoke of restoring the democratic path, but said little about the foreign interests financing their return. CTA, Thought-provoking. If sovereignty can be undermined with money instead of bombs, who truly holds the power? Comment your view and subscribe to Africa News, where truth breaks silence. AES governments responded not with arrests, but with exposure. In a bold move, the Ministry of Civic Affairs of Burkina Faso released a full report detailing the funding chains behind underground protests. In a public forum, Traore stated, "We do not fear opposition. We fear manipulation instead of repression." The Transparency and Trust campaign was launched. Weekly town halls allowed citizens to question ministers on policy, budgets, and border strategies. Sessions were live-streamed and open to media. The message was clear. Disagreement was welcomed. Sabotage was not. Still, tensions rose. Prices soared as ECOWAS tightened sanctions. Banks froze AES accounts. The World Bank suspended $250 million in infrastructure loans, citing institutional instability. In response, AES enacted a national resource redirection plan, temporarily halting all non-essential imports. Domestic industries were prioritized. Farmers were paid bonuses to scale up food production. Textile workshops reopened to clothe local militias and schoolchildren alike. And amid all this, the people did not riot. In Kaya, mothers gathered to sew school uniforms together. In Gao, volunteers organized medication drives. In Niamey, imams and priests shared one microphone to pray for national unity. They knew what was happening, but they also knew something else. This time, they had chosen this path. CTA, community-based. If you believe that resistance begins with the people, not politicians, click follow. Stand with Africa's silent storm. Traore remained calm. In his weekly address, he stood in a field, holding soil in his hand. "They say we have no allies," he said, "but this land, this is our oldest ally." And it never turned its back. As the pressure mounted and foreign powers tightened their grip, something extraordinary began to unfold across the Sahel, not a military breakthrough, nor a diplomatic victory, but something far more defiant. Collective stillness. On the 28th of July, in a moment that would later be studied in political science classes across Africa, all three AES governments made a synchronized announcement. It contained no threats, no demands, just this: "We will speak not in anger, but in dignity. Watch us." At first, it puzzled the world, but within hours, the true meaning emerged. In the capitals of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, schools remained open, markets bustling, and traffic flowing, but a quiet campaign took root in the hearts of the people. They called it Operation Presence. In Ouagadougou, families tied AES-colored scarves to the gates of their homes. In Bamako, farmers painted their tractors with unity symbols. In Niamey, students gathered to recite independence poems in public squares, not shouting, but whispering. This was not a protest. This was a declaration. CTA, gentle invitation. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that silence can be stronger than violence, leave a comment, share this message, and subscribe to Africa News for more untold truths from the continent. And yet, outside forces did not understand. They launched new diplomatic offensives. ECOWAS called another emergency summit. France offered humanitarian aid, but with conditions. The IMF proposed limited funding, but only if AES leadership submitted to political reforms. None of it landed. Instead, AES delivered a different response. On the 2nd of August, Ibrahim Traoré announced that AES would host the first Pan-African Civic Forum, an event not for presidents, but for teachers, midwives, engineers, and students. Delegations came from Gabon, Chad, and even South Sudan. At the closing ceremony, a 22-year-old woman from Zinda, Niger, stood on stage. She held no degree, no title, but her words brought the entire hall to its feet. "We are not just surviving, we are redefining what survival means. Not as dependency, but as dignity." That was the moment the world realized. AES had changed the question. It was no longer will they resist, but what if they succeed? Final CTA, rise with them. If you believe dignity matters more than dominance, then this is your moment too. Subscribe to Africa News. Share your voice. Because history isn't written by the loudest, it's written by those who endure. The ripple effects were immediate. In Ghana, young journalists began questioning their government's stance on sanctions. In Cameroon, Student unions organized forums on self-determination. Even in Senegal, where official policy remained pro-ECOWAS, online polls showed rising support for the AES position. The Western media narrative faltered. Failed states. Some headlines had once asked, but now, images of clean streets, rebuilt classrooms, and peaceful civic forums began circulating globally. AES was not imploding, it was reimagining. In response, ECOWAS quietly postponed its next round of sanctions. France, too, shifted tone. Where once there had been condemnation, now came veiled references to respecting regional complexity. The unthinkable had happened. Resistance through silence had worked. In a radio address, Traore reflected, "They thought we would scream, but we listened. They thought we would lash out, but we built. This is not weakness. This is the hardest kind of strength." And still, the world watched. Not because of military power or mineral wealth, but because three nations had dared to imagine a future written by their own hand. So now the question is no longer if the AES can endure, but if the rest of Africa is ready to follow. Final CTA. Legacy begins with truth. If your heart beats for justice, if you believe the dignity of the people is worth more than the comfort of the powerful, then be part of this new story. Like, share, subscribe to Africa News, because this is not the end, it is only the beginning.